So I'd like to share a story with you this morning, but before I do, I want to offer something of a disclaimer. I want to acknowledge that the story I'm about to tell you reveals in pretty stark relief the privilege that I grew up in and that I currently enjoy. I am blessed to live in a mostly functional family that has always been financially secure. I've never worried about where my next meal will come from or whether I'll be sleeping under a roof on any particular night, and certainly never worried about armed conflict arriving at my doorstep. As a child, I never wanted for anything, and today I'm still able to live in a way that is financially advantaged. I think it's important to acknowledge this privilege, for all of us to acknowledge whatever privileges that we have, that we've grown up with or that we have now. Not just because I know that there are those here or online this morning who are disadvantaged or marginalized in some way, or whose childhoods were challenging or even horrible, and who maybe can't relate to the story I'm about to tell. But because I think it's important to recognize and name our privilege, whatever it may be, to be grateful for it, and to affirm that with privilege comes responsibility. So with that in mind, I want to share my story. Each year, since the time I was about 10 years old, my older sister and I would get put on a plane out of New York, out of LaGuardia Airport, to fly down to Florida to visit my grandparents for a week for spring break. We would fly down and meet my Nana and Pops at the airport. They spent their winters in Naples, Florida, which at that time, when I was young, was a relatively quiet town on the southwest coast. My grandparents had a small house on a canal, a 2-bedroom house made out of cinder blocks. It was on a corner canal, and the canal led out to Naples Bay and then on into the Gulf of Mexico. It was a perfect location for my grandfather, who loved to fish. One of the things that I most loved to do when I visited my Nana and Pops was to go out in my grandfather's boat and to hunt for dolphins. Now, not hunt dolphins, mind you, but hunt for dolphins. We would look for them in the bay or the Gulf and try to coax them to play in the wake of the boat. And if you went just the right speed, the dolphins would ride in the wake behind us, and they would come out of the water almost close enough that you could touch them. Now, one of the most vivid memories I have of this time, of these boat rides when I was young, was that as we cruised around and passed other boats, everyone would wave at each other, just a little friendly wave. Every time you passed another boat, the folks in the other boat would acknowledge us with a wave and usually a smile, and we'd wave back at them. For a little kid, this was great fun. It seemed like it was almost a rule of the sea because everyone did it. But it didn't feel like we were doing it because it was a rule. It felt like boaters were just really friendly people, and it was fun to be around them. A smile, a wave, and then you'd go on about your business. It left a big impression on me when I was young. Now, a few years back, as an adult, I was visiting my parents who had moved into my grandparents' home after they had died, and I had my young daughters with me. And they, too, would like to go out in my parents' boat to go hunting for dolphins. The same canal, the same Bay of Naples, the same Gulf of Mexico. But I noticed something different. When we would take our daughters out, people weren't waving as much. Sure, there were some whose hands came up automatically as you passed them, but there was a marked shift in the pattern that I had grown up with. Most of the boaters would look in your direction and then look away without a wave. It felt like that look was more about checking you out or checking out your boat. Sometimes the looks would feel judgmental. A quick glance your way felt like the other boater was just kind of dismissing you. A long, lingering gaze made you wonder if they were thinking of boarding you or something like a pirate. In either case, it certainly felt like the seas were much less friendly than those of my childhood. Now, I found myself trying to rationalize the decline of this phenomenon of the friendly wave. At first, I attributed it to the influx of visitors to Southwest Florida for the past several decades. Newcomers perhaps never learned the custom. Or maybe it was just that there were so many more people who rented boats for a day. They weren't boat owners, and the instructions from the rental place didn't include a line that told people, make sure you give a friendly wave to everyone you pass. I don't know if this phenomenon is a sign or a symptom of the downfall of Western civilization, the canary in the coal mine, if you will, but it was noticeable to me and again left an impression on me. And so over the past few years, as I've made my annual trek to Naples to visit my parents and taken countless boat rides, I've been observing this phenomenon, and it became something of a social experiment for me, a litmus test on the health of our society in general. More waves represented happier, more generous people. Fewer waves meant more judgment, more insecurity, more aggression, maybe even. And as I conducted my experiment, something dawned on me. A big old light bulb went on over my head, and maybe you can guess about it now. While I was busy watching to see if other people were going to wave, I wasn't waving. I wasn't just witnessing the decline of the friendly wave. I was part of it. In my attempt to analyze what was going on, I lost sight of the fact that I am not just an outside observer, some scientist watching lab rats navigate a maze. I am a participant. I am one of the rats. And I felt like a rat when I realized what had happened. When I think about what it takes to have a generous spirit, to be a generous spirit, to widen the circle, as this month's theme talks about, I think it starts with this. It starts with remembering that we're not just observers of others, standing apart from what's happening all around us. We are a part of the circle, not apart from it. We're part of the world that we see. We are actors on the same stage, playing out the drama as it unfolds before us. As much as we'd sometimes like to be standing on the sidelines, offering advice or criticism or perhaps even judgment, as much as we'd sometimes like to deny our role in what's happening in front of us, we are part and parcel of it, part of the larger whole. We are of this world, no matter how much we might sometimes like to deny it, especially when life isn't going according to our plans. And we aren't just bit players on this stage. We are script writers and poets and playwrights. We are co-creators of our world, both our interior world and our external reality. We have power and agency. We can choose to be generous or stingy, loving or aloof, connected or isolated. We choose whether to nurture or to neglect our relationships. We choose to support or criticize. We choose whether to be open and vulnerable with others or to clam up and withdraw. Whether or not the circle widens is not entirely up to us, but if we don't actively try, it just might not happen. Our choices matter in the world that we make, the world that we create. We can, in everything we do, choose to exhibit a generosity of spirit. A generous spirit is like great art or fine food. You know it when you experience it, but it's hard to define. We know it when we see it manifested either in ourselves or in others. A friend of mine was telling me about her stepfather who had recently passed away. She described him as something of a curmudgeon within the family, although she had a good relationship with him. But the strange thing about him was how he was out in public. She told me that the neighborhood where he lived had deteriorated over the decades he'd been living there, and that now it's a pretty shady part of town where she was scared to even go out at night herself. But her stepdad would love to take walks through the neighborhood, and sometimes she would go with him. We'd come across some pretty sketchy characters, she told me, but every time her stepdad would encounter someone on their walk, each and every time, no matter who it was or how they looked, he would greet them with a loud and hearty, "Hey, how you doing?" And she told me, to a person, that greeting would be returned with a smile. That's a sign of a generous spirit, a willingness to open oneself up to others, no matter their identity or circumstance. Having a generosity of spirit is about being both bold and vulnerable. It's about opening our hearts up to the world and inviting the world into our hearts, even if it causes our hearts to break. It's about choosing to see the best in a particular person or situation instead of assuming the worst. And there's an element of presence in this concept too. To have a generous spirit is to be present to the world, in the world, having an awareness of what's happening right now, right in front of us, or right inside of us. It's about being fascinated instead of frustrated, curious instead of judgmental. Consider how we react to a pushy driver who honks their horn at us if we don't jump on the accelerator the instant the light turns green. Are we angry at their impatience? Or do we consider the possibility that that person is anxious because he's late picking up his child? Do we curse or bless the woman ahead of us in the grocery store line who was fumbling through her purse trying to find the coupon she knows she put in there somewhere? And how about this? Do we curse or bless that woman when that woman is us? As Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker reminds us in our reading today, we can choose. We can choose to bless or curse the world. The Dalai Lama tells us that generosity is the most natural outward expression of an inner attitude of compassion and loving kindness. When one desires to alleviate the suffering of others, he says, and to promote their well-being, then generosity, in action, word, and thought, is this desire put into practice. He goes on to remind us that it is important to recognize that generosity here refers not just to giving in a material sense, but to generosity of the heart. And so generosity of heart, of spirit, begins at home with the cultivation of an inner attitude of compassion and loving kindness. As in most matters of the spirit, we must first tend our own garden. First cultivate this inner attitude and then act upon it. And to practice it upon ourselves, especially when we fall short of our own expectations for ourselves. Sitting on my parents' boat on a sunny afternoon a few winters ago, I had the epiphany that I mentioned, that light bulb moment. In watching others not wave, I had forgotten to wave myself. I had become stingy, miserly with my waves, judgmental of those who passed by without so much as a nod in my direction. And so from that point forward, I tried a different kind of experiment. Very simple. I committed to wave first. To wave first. I committed not to wait for another boater to wave to me and only then return the favor, but to extend the greeting to everyone we passed and let them respond as they would. I was going to be extravagant in my waving, to wave early and often. And I had a big smile, too. I was going to say through this gesture, just like my friend's stepdad, "Hey, how are you doing?" And you know what? You know what? Most people waved back. Most people waved back. Not everyone, but most. And they smiled back, too. And I'd like to think they waved first at the next boat that they passed, but that's not really the point. Because the really important thing is what happened inside of me. By choosing to wave first, I felt my heart open to others, my heart open to the world. I let go of my judgment around people who didn't wave at me while I waited. I didn't wonder what happened to the world of my childhood that I so longed for. By the simple act of waving first, I recreated that world for myself and for others. And maybe, just maybe, it's as simple as that. To nurture a generous spirit in ourselves, to widen the circle of our concern, to birth generosity and joy into the world, all we have to do is wave first. This day and every day, I wish you peace. Amen.